Hey guys, Pastor Ben here with another review and reflection. Today I want to talk about a wonderful classic book that I'm sure you're all familiar with at some level, A Christmas Carol written by Charles Dickens. And I was reading it from this edition. It's one of the Wordsworth classics. It's called Christmas Books by Charles Dickens. So it has A Christmas Carol, it has The Chimes, it has The Cricket on the Hearth, The Battle of Life, and The Haunted Man. So I haven't read all of those, but did want to reread the classic book, A Christmas Carol. I started this around Christmas thinking, oh, I'll read this over Christmas week. And it ended up taking me like 2 or 3 months because I was so interrupted by other things. So I'm sure you know what that's like. But I did finally get to finish it the other day and wanted to do a review of this book. Just another personal thing. This copy of the book was picked up for me by my parents when they were in England visiting me when I used to live in England, and they bought this at a bookshop there and gave it to me for Christmas 10 years ago, exactly. So kind of a cool thing. So that was fun to pick that up and reread that again, both for that personal history and then just also because Dickens is wonderful and A Christmas Carol is a wonderful, wonderful little book. So if you don't know about this book, let me just kind of give you a sketch of what Dickens is doing in this story. So this is a kind of a long short story or short novel, depending on how you want to look at it, about 100 pages or so. And what Dickens is doing is he's, as he so often is, setting a story in mid 19th century Victorian London. He's writing at a time where there's great social turmoil. The Industrial Revolution is in full swing. There's a whole swath of people throughout England that are rising in wealth and influence, those who are starting factories and engaged in business and so forth. And so there's this elevation of life from one vantage point as tremendous wealth is generated in England and in other industrializing countries. But along with that, you have this incredible exploitation that's taking place because many in the lower classes, people who had grown up in farming communities traditionally, are moving into the city. They're taking up jobs in factories. They're working long hours. They're being taken advantage of, injured. There's very little social safety net to protect these people. And so it's an age of extremes and inequalities in different ways. And while one of the things that Dickens often brings into his novels is what it can look like to be a good employer or factory owner or whatever, he'll also give you these kind of chilling examples of people who are just cruel and greedy and exploitative. And perhaps the most famous of those kinds of characters is the protagonist of A Christmas Carol, a man named Ebenezer Scrooge, right? Dickens has a great way of picking names where when you hear someone's name, you just know what kind of character they are, and Ebenezer Scrooge is definitely one of those. He is a bitter old man, never married, who is a kind of cold, calculating businessman. And so the opening scene we have of him is he is kind of tormenting his poor clerk, his employee, not even giving him enough coal to keep warm in the winter, and kind of berating him over the smallest things. And we see him having this kind of very chilling conversation with some people who stop by trying to raise money for charity. They're going to different local businessmen and trying to see if they want to give to help give a meal to the poor. And Scrooge just shuts them down and basically says the only thing the poor need is prisons and poorhouses and things like that. And if they don't have the means of supporting themselves, they should just die to take care of the surplus population. So that kind of gives you a flavor for who Scrooge is. And then we see Scrooge go home, and the rest of the book is where we're seeing Scrooge be visited by three different spirits, Christmas spirits, the ghost of Christmas past, the ghost of Christmas present, and the ghost of Christmas future. And in each of these encounters, Scrooge is shown these visions by these Christmas spirits, and he has to learn from them how he has become this kind of twisted, cruel, greedy man who's almost lost his humanity in this, and how not only has that changed who he was in the past, but it's inflicting pain in the present, and it's going to lead to his own grave in the future, a grave where no one mourns for him, no one is sorry when he dies. And so through the story, I won't tell all the ins and outs, right? But you get to sort of see Scrooge begin to grow in his self-awareness and begin to grow in his humanity, begin to be convicted about his greed and selfishness and all of that, and begin to change as a person. And so the end of the story then is him changing his life radically. And where before he was a penny pinching, greedy, selfish man, he becomes a generous, kind, loving man who just enjoys life and pours himself out for others and becomes greatly loved. So this is, as you can kind of tell, a kind of classic Victorian morality tale that's designed to prick the consciences of those in Victorian England who were not sensitive to the plights of others or to perhaps their own selfishness and greed in different ways. And so Dickens is trying to use Ebenezer Scrooge as this foil to help people see themselves better, see the problems and inequalities in their society more clearly, and be moved with compassion to do something about it, to help people. And again, in Dickens' day, you could imagine someone writing that kind of a morality play today, and it would probably end with a plea for more government programs and things. Not that Dickens was necessarily against, organized or structured charities, but he's really, I think, and this is part of what makes it so powerful, it's not just a call for policies to change, it's a call for people to change. Not that those have to be exclusive of one another. I think ideally, in a healthy society, they'll go together, but that kind of personal impulse is really good because it doesn't just leave you feeling self-righteous if you support the right policies. It kind of convicts you to say, how am I doing as a person? And actually showing love and kindness to others. And this has become one of the classic Dickens stories and one of the classic Christmas stories because kind of the conceit that Dickens uses is the Christmas season. Again, the spirit of Christmas, right? He uses that, he does a play on words there where the spirit of Christmas he imagines as being these spirits or ghosts who are showing Scrooge these different visions. And he's really kind of holding up Christmas as this time where there's this call and invitation to love and goodwill and acts of kindness and generosity, and saying that whole spirit, that whole vibe, if you want to use our modern word, is something that should mark us, not just on Christmas Day, but kind of throughout the year. Now, if any of that sounds kind of trite or cliche to you, that's because this book has been so incredibly influential and powerful. Because we have heard that story countless times before. You can probably think of all sorts of Christmas songs and Christmas movies and Christmas stories that end up making that point. But that's because they are downstream of what Dickens was doing in A Christmas Carol. So it's one of those things that we can read it now and maybe almost feel like this is kind of cliche, but that's only because what Dickens laid out has become so influential since then. So it's really something that's had a tremendous impact, culturally speaking, on the way that we think about Christmas and kind of the typical story of Christmas ever since. And the Victorian age is a time where a lot of the things that we think of as these kind of ancient Christmas traditions that have always happened, a lot of them are starting in the Victorian era or kind of being codified there. So that's part of what's going on here, is that Dickens is not only kind of writing something that reflects the way we celebrate Christmas, he's really writing something that shapes the way that we will come to celebrate Christmas. And so it's really influential from that vantage point as well. Part of what's going on behind the scenes in all of this, and I found this fascinating. I was picking up there's a classic biography of Dickens by Edgar Johnson. This was written back in the 1950s, called Charles Dickens, His Tragedy and Triumph. It's a 2-volume work. This is volume 1. And part of what Johnson does in that book is to walk you through the life of Charles Dickens, but then he'll also zoom in whenever a book is published and sort of do an analysis of that and tell you what was going on. And the Christmas Carol was written at a really interesting time in Dickens' life, where he had written a number of books. He was an accomplished author, but he was hitting kind of a bit of a down swing. He had just published Martin Chuzzlewit, which is a great story, but not well known today. and it wasn't his most popular work then. It wasn't selling as well as the publishers wanted, and so Dickens was frustrated by that. He was racking up a lot of debt. He really felt like he needed a break. He wanted to be able to pull away from the grind of writing. He wanted to travel to Europe and just kind of get fresh ideas, fresh scenes, so he could kind of be recharged as an author, but he wasn't really able to do that. And then he contracted to write a little book called A Christmas Carol. And he started it in the beginning of October, and it so grabbed him and energized him, this story, that he had finished it by the end of November. So in less than 2 months, he had written this book, and it became, I think, the best-selling of his books, but certainly one of the best-sellings. It was just tremendous. It sold like 6,000 copies on the very first day, and just went on from there. And so he was able to pay off his debts. He was able to go to Europe. He was able to get recharged, and he was able to kind of move forward as a writer. But he was also having some real controversies with his publishers and things, people that he had been close to in the past that he kind of felt betrayed by. So you won't get into all the ins and outs of what was going on there, but he was kind of becoming a little bit of a Scrooge character, you might say, just kind of very turned in on himself and discouraged and frustrated and all of this. And the writing of A Christmas Carol kind of matched with this return to humanity for Dickens in one sense, at least as Johnson sort of tells that story. And so it was something that didn't just turn his fortunes around financially, but kind of re-energized and recharged him as a person. And so it's an interesting story to kind of put in its context and see what it was doing in Dickens' life, and then again historically to see how it's influenced the way that we think and celebrate Christmas right down to the present day. One last thing I'll mention about this book again has been so well known, and even if you've never read the book, you probably know the story because there have been countless movie adaptations and audio dramas and plays and things like that. Maybe you've seen A Muppet's Christmas Carol or something like that, but you probably know the story, right? And it's very influential, and it's very insightful, and it's very moving and really wonderful. But there's an interesting feature that I think we can sometimes miss, and that is that Dickens, in this book, and again, he's setting a trajectory that we're living downstream of. And I think one of the kind of fruits of that is that Dickens, as he talks about Christmas, he has a few token allusions to God or to Christ or to church, but he is very much presenting this not as a story that's centered on the gospel, but as, in a sense, a very modern kind of take on Christmas. Christmas as a time of goodwill. Christmas as a time of well wishes and of generosity and kindness. Christmas as a time for family, right? That type of thing, which is obviously capturing part of what we love about the Christmas season, but it is missing what drives that, what produces that. And I think what you see there, again, Johnson kind of relays this, that Dickens at this point in his life, he's not an atheist, of course. He would still see himself as a Christian, but he is increasingly antagonistic towards the kind of official Orthodox teaching of the Church of England. Dickens denies the virgin birth. He's kind of flirting with Unitarianism, and I think his emphasis is more on humanity than it is on the good news of the gospel. And that's something that I think we might miss as we read this because we're so familiar with it. And he is still a Victorian. He's still writing in the 19th century, so he will still allude to the gospel and the church in different ways. But I do think that's a kind of legacy of this book that is part of its history. It's part of its legacy, that it kind of sets you up for, you think about, Miracle on 34th Street or, some of these kind of, classic Christmas movies and things that really have nothing to do with Christmas, biblically and theologically speaking. And I'm not necessarily drawing any particular conclusion from that, but just sort of observing this is one of the things that kind of pushes us down that line and creates a context where you can write about Christmas without really linking that to Christ. And I think that's something that for Christians who are reading this book, there's a moral lesson to be learned here from the book. We don't want to become like Scrooge, and yet what Dickens doesn't do is connect that to Christ in a way that I think we need to if we're going to really understand how to live as not just generous people, but godly people. So more we could say about that, but bottom line, wonderful book, very engaging, very short. So a good thing to read as a family or as an individual, maybe as you approach Christmas time. So I encourage you to, if you haven't read it, read it, or if you have read it, maybe reread A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens.